For those serious about the sport of fitness, now is the time to build strength, gymnastic skills, and improve your overall capacity. We have divisions for RX, intermediate, masters, and elite athletes. For more information, go to trainingthinktank.com. Chris, when are you going to post this one?
Whenever, dude.
All right, so as of right now, weekend number 2 of semifinals is starting. We wanted to just sit down and kind of talk about the workouts, the recap from weekend number 1, because we had a bunch of coaches that were at North America East.
Yeah.
We have athletes going this weekend and all of the different semifinals, so we are going to kind of give a little bit of a preview there, but we won't spoil too much of that because we don't know when it's going to be posted. The first thing I want to talk about, just the workouts in general. The construction this year has been different, to say the least, compared to previous years. But that doesn't necessarily mean it's good or bad. I think on social media, since we were talking about that earlier, it has tended towards extremely negative. And
Sure.
maybe some of that is fair. I think some of it probably is unfair. People don't like change. And so I wanted to kind of get your thought on that, the entire process of like, what does it look like from open to quarterfinals to semifinals? And then we can kind of talk about how that changes programming over the course of the next year. But first, just like initial thoughts when the workouts came out, and then we'll talk about what happened after you saw athletes do those.
Yeah, initial thoughts. I think that they fit our picture of how he likes to program. So coming into the semifinals, and even like when we were preparing athletes for quarterfinals, like our bias, our interpretation of his preference for programming is that he likes to, I don't even know if he does it on purpose when he creates, but what it looks like, how it actually manifests on paper and out on the field is usually inside of a test, there is one very specific bottleneck, and you can usually see it on paper before anybody goes and tests it. You know ahead of time, all right, this is going to be the linchpin of this workout. And what we try to do in our prep for semifinals was we try to make really, really sure that we tested things like that and we touched things like that really often. And it was less about like more classical CrossFit tests like Fran and Grace and Karen and all that stuff, where it's like just very, very straightforward. On this, it's like we are trying to highlight very specific qualities, very specific modalities, how we are testing strength under fatigue, how we are testing gymnastics complexity. So looking at these tests, Max and I sat down when they were released and we're like, I feel like we did a really good job preparing for that, because looking at all of them, like you can just pick out, this is where the separation is going to come from. This is where the bottleneck is going to come from. And from there, you just work your way backwards into a strategy and a game plan for each test in isolation, and also over the weekend as a whole.
Yeah, in the past, we've seen workouts that are like that, right? In other words, they have like one specific bottleneck, to your point. Mm-hmm. Maybe in event 1, it's like the sled pull. We didn't know it was going to be that much of a bottleneck in North America East, and it looks like it may not be as much so in other semifinals because the floor slides a little bit easier. But we haven't seen that across all 6 tests or 7 tests, where like each one you can identify, if you're not good at this one thing, you're going to really fall behind. So for example, in event 1, it ended up being the sled pull. In event number 2, for most people, it ended up being the ring muscle ups. In fact, there was an athlete that made the games that couldn't even get through a full complex of the muscle ups, which, we could talk about. Event 3, it came down to the dumbbell bench press. Event 4, it was only snatch. The run didn't matter at the front end of that. The back end, the run did matter, and it almost became just the run as opposed to a combination of the snatch and the run. And then event 6 was just the legless rope climb. So the only real one that maybe didn't have a huge separator was event 7, but I still would argue that the bike just became that.
Yeah, but it was probably the closest, though.
The closest,
like
for
if
sure.
You work your way through all those, that was probably the closest in terms of usually what I try and think about is if you have athletes at different ends of the spectrum in terms of like power or skill or endurance or speed and something like that, like usually if you see a test, like you're probably going to have to come up with a different strategy for each one of those athletes on either side of the spectrum. 7 was one of those ones where it was like, all right, well, I can actually adjust strategy based off of the athlete avatar in front of me and think, all right, we're going to try and buy time on the bike. We're going to try and buy time on toe to bar cycle rate. We're going to try and buy time with transitions. Everything else is just like, all right, this is what we have to do. Like, this is just the nature of this test right now. So I'm not sure if it's a good or bad thing. I think that it is just his style of programming. I'm going to I hesitate to offer too much critique as a whole, because what I want to do is I want to see what he does at the games. Because the other thing that you notice, and this is sort of an after effect, we maybe saw this coming ahead of time, but this style of test at the semifinal level, it selects for a certain kind of athlete, right? We are seeing very big guys come out of this. We are seeing very big, strong girls do really well with this style of programming. I'm not sure what that means for the games level. I'm not sure if he's like holding back some of the gymnastic stuff, or he's holding back some of the longer endurance stuff that where an athlete can't really produce power based off of their body weight. It's really just more about endurance. So I'm trying to keep too many of those critiques behind for now, because for right now, it's just very clear, straightforward. Like, if you are big and strong and can move your body and you can breathe at a requisite level, you're going to do really well with this series of tests.
Let's pause there for a second. Let's pause there and say we go to the games and he does do all those things you just said. Those tests show up. Does that satisfy? Now do you look back at regional or I keep calling it regionals, dude.
It
Semifinals.
felt like regionals.
Yeah. Now you look back at semifinals, and does that feel good to you?
Yeah, I hope that that's how they go about the programming. I hope that he kind of takes this big season-long view of how he's going to approach the season and where he's going to test certain things, or he sees his bias in his semifinal level programming and thinks, all right, this is the kind of athlete that we're going to get through this. This is how I want to be able to test them, so it's a little bit more unique, and we're testing or prioritizing a different sort of athletic quality when we get to the games level. That's what I'd like. Like, if that comes out of the games, I feel like that is a very, very big positive check mark for him.
It checks one of the boxes. It still doesn't check all the boxes for me. I would prefer to see well-rounded programming in each stage. So in other words, maybe have one of those style of tests in the open and then have one really like fast, high heart rate, high respiratory rate, no bottleneck test in the open, and then have a strength test in the open. I'm perfectly fine with that because then it's well-rounded and you'll probably get better, the right selection of athletes. Now, the open maybe doesn't matter as much because the top 10% will be that regardless of kind of how they shift things around, other than maybe like 1 or 2%, right? Like that 8 to 12% mark maybe kind of shuffles around. And then the same thing in quarterfinals. This year was very similar to semifinals, at least in my opinion, in that most of the workouts had one major bottleneck. Yeah. Event 1 with the handstand push-ups. Like, people got there in 7.5 minutes, and then it took them another 7.5 minutes to do the 20 handstand push-ups, or 21, whatever the number was. And you saw that across the test, and then again, the same thing in semifinals. It just seems like the same test keep coming up, the same style of tests. And again, if that is going to be the type of programming that happens over the course of the next decade, then we'll change the way that we program, and we'll talk about that in another clip. Mm-hmm. However, what we've seen over the last 10, 12 years is different than that. And so my question is like, is he intentionally trying to just completely shift things to, it's no longer like the breather, the person that has really good high volume, dense gymnastics tolerance, and now it's just about the bigger athlete that can kind of move barbells and can do the complex gymnastics that doesn't really take a lot of, dense skill? Or is it just he thinks he's testing those things and he's not?
Yeah, I don't know. I don't know what the intent is. I'd like to think that he, like, you think about 6, like the overhead squat and the row, right? Like, they're in there, but they don't really matter too much for that test. The last 20 got tough, but at North America East, we had 2 bars, so nobody could really like separate too much on the overhead squats. It's really just if you blew up at the end. Why are those even there? Like, why not just have that be handstand walk, rope climb, handstand push-up, rope climb, handstand walk? It's still, I think the same people win that test.
So it would have been almost exactly the same, I think.
Yes, and so
based on the split times.
In my mind, it's like, okay, I'm going through my checklist as I'm programming for this event. I need another strength movement. We're going to put overhead squats here. We're going to put 20 of them. I need to make this a little bit breathier. I'm going to put 500-meter row. But it's not that. It doesn't change the test when you do that. It's just like adding for the sake of adding. And so I'm not sure what the intent is behind it, because, again, if he knows where the limiter is inside of that, to add more stuff on top of that doesn't change that. And so really, what was it that you were trying to test with all of that? Yeah. So
I would
the
definitely.
Intent,
do you think them putting out the intents for each workout would be a good idea? Or would that bring more criticism?
What I would love is I would love to have a little bit more transparency behind the thought process. And I understand why they don't do that, right? Like, they probably don't want to open up and like pull back the curtain and say like, here's how we think about fitness, because it's like, then they lose the idea of unknown and unknowable, right? Like, they want to keep that back behind the curtain. I think more transparency behind the test process is really good for a couple of reasons. 1, I think athlete safety is probably the most important. I think 2, judging standards is probably like right up there with it. We need a little bit more clarity around, how did you test this? What was it like when you tried to test these events back to back? How did things build up in terms of fatigue for the athlete over the course of the weekend? Were the things that you thought tested actually tested, or did they turn into something else and then you have to go back and change the initial stimulus that you thought about? Things like that, I feel like if you can talk about that stuff, I feel like as a sport, we can probably grow a little bit more, because then it brings more minds into the conversation, which is always a good thing in my mind. I think that they have a review process. I've heard them talked about it before. They have a testing process. I've seen it done before when they went back and they ran through all those games tests on their YouTube channel. I worry that it seems a little bit too much internal, right? Not that there's like a hive mind or like an echo chamber, but I just feel like if you think something and then like your best friend goes and checks it, they're probably not going to give you like the best feedback. Or if you ask 5 of your friends, maybe some of them who aren't even involved with the process of it, you might get a better sort of understanding, or at least like a different perspective on things. And that's what I want out of it. And so whether it's like the players union, whether it's like a collection of coaches, whether it's past athletes who are retired, what I want is I want a little bit more transparency about what went into the test selection, what went into the testing process, and then also what's going into making sure that the standards are clear and upholdable from a judge perspective, because that's what we want for the sport. We want to make sure the athletes are safe. We want to make sure that the standards are clear, and we want to make sure that we're trying to create as clean of a spectacle as possible while still being a spectacle. It has to be exciting. Totally. So all of those things I feel like is where I want the sport to go. I'm not sure how those boxes are being checked because we don't know. Like, everything's in a black box right now.
Yeah, I agree. I want to talk about event 6 again because you brought up the row and the overhead squat. And it's funny, I think we said this a little bit on the live, but like to get some more behind the scenes, and I think Noah would be okay with me sharing this. He came off after he won that event, and he crushed it. Like, that was fun to watch, obviously being a friend and seeing him execute really well. When he walked back, he said to me and Max, he's like, I don't mean this in like an egotistical way, but that was the easiest semifinal or regional workout I've ever done.
Yeah.
And I was like, what? That was like, people were really struggling. He's like, I don't mean it in like there were bottlenecks. He's like, but because I didn't get bottlenecked and I had to pace, everything just felt easy. He's like, I had to wait in between rope climbs. I broke my handstand push-ups up because I didn't want to fail a rope climb. Yeah. He said that the pirouette, he just took some time before he started. And then on the row,
you had to row at a certain pace.
He said on the row, he got back on and he's like, I'm going to row at a 152, which for him is slow. And then again, with the barbells, he's like, if there was one barbell, it would have been much harder to do 20 unbroken. But with 2, he's like, I know I can do 10, rest, do another 10.
That was such an interesting choice. I don't know why 2 barbells. If you want to progress down the lane and show like where races are happening at the very end, I get it. Just have them use 1 barbell. Because it creates more separation. It creates more excitement. There are going to be athletes who are going to try and do 20 unbroken.
Totally.
Do they walk with it overhead? Do they throw it in front of them and go snatch into the next rep? Like, it just makes it more exciting.
Even on the first part, the first 20, that would have changed the game because guys would have done 20 unbroken and they would have been messed up.
It changes things. Yeah. And I don't understand that. Maybe it was a safety thing in terms of how they laid out the floor. I don't know what it is. There was clearly a reason for it because it was more logistics, it was more equipment, and like they made it harder for themselves, and I don't know the reason why.
Is the assumption there with you talking about Noah's pacing that if other people went back and did it and they just paced
most people
slower?
Couldn't do what Noah did.
I think it's more of a commentary to Noah. Like, the bottleneck in that workout was a specific strength for him, and so the workout in itself, because of that, just wasn't hard.
But if the workout was tested in a different way, it could have been really hard for everyone, and you would have had to do kind of the old school CrossFit thing of grinding things out. Like, if it was just regular legless rope climbs, even in that workout, everyone would have, like, even the females would have flown through that part, and then you would have had a race on the row and the overhead squats, which probably would have made it more entertaining. Would it have been a better test? Like, we can have that conversation, but again, it's just that the tests are different than what we've seen in the past, and that's what we're talking about.
We're going to podcast with Alexis soon, but I want to ask you guys, just how do you think your athletes feel about this style of programming, the bottleneck style? Are they digging it, or they kind of want to get away from it?
It's definitely more pressure, right? Because no rep in this scenario, especially turning where it's at, can be very costly, can be very expensive. Versus like if you take a CrossFit style workout, say like what was open test 1? It was like the 60-50. It was the way down of that. If you miss a ring muscle up in that, it's like, all right, I missed. I'm gonna rest 10 seconds, get back up. If you miss a ring muscle up in that complex, that's a problem. Right? That's a problem. And so this is like, if for people who are at semifinals trying to make it to the games, and they know where the specific bottleneck is, it places a ton of pressure on that bottleneck to make sure that you are doing things exactly right. There's basically I feel like there's less room for error.
I agree. And I actually really appreciate that. The challenge, and we've talked about this for years, even when the workouts weren't like this, is that judging also plays a bigger role. So we had multiple athletes that got, for example, on the ring muscle up complex. One of my athletes was no repped on the last ring dip of the complex, and she did the whole thing unbroken, then gets no repped on that. And that was extremely costly for her. For an event that probably would have been a top 10 to now she's 25th in the event. And that's a ton of points on a leaderboard where she didn't do well in a couple workouts. So in that case, it could be costly because you just make a mistake, you miss pace, or you get a judge that no reps you, or like Annika, for example, on the legless rope climb that maybe costs her a game spot. And so I think the people that are programming, Bosman and others, have to also think about it in that way, that the standards, if you're going to make these huge bottlenecks or these bottlenecks that are extremely important, the standards have to be very clear.
Yeah, same thing happened to Jake. He missed that vital muscle up in the end of the second round. It's just like, there goes the workout right there. Because then he's pushing to come back. He's at failure. He misses another one. Like, it changes everything. Yeah. So the cost, the expense in this style of programming, I feel like it does put more pressure on the athletes to make sure that they are not going all the way to red line, especially where that separation, where that expense is going to come.
The one thing I'd point out is most of these are very determined on local fatigue, as opposed to it being like just a true, like what we call engine, right? And so that has changed too. So maybe the programming changes, which we'll talk about, but the nature of these tests, it was less about like, quote unquote, how good your engine is, and more about, are you good at a specific movement?
Yeah. I mean, I'd love to know the intention and the stimulus behind them, because you look at test 1 and usually at the regional style level or even the semifinal style level, we like to start long. Like we like to sort of like get out there and have an endurance test or like a longer test. That endurance test favored the bigger athlete. And so it's like, what were you trying to test there? Were you trying to test running capacity? Because if so, that didn't really, at least in North America East.
Let me stop you there, because I want to play a little game real quick before we move on. We're going to do what we loved and what we hated through these workouts. We'll just do it real quick, just kind of giving some feedback to those that are about to go this weekend.
I'm so excited about this.
Okay, so
if you enjoyed this clip from episode 132 of the Corpus Animus podcast, click on the screen to see the other clips, or if you want to listen to the audio version with the full thing, check out all the other major podcast providers. Yeah, that sounds good. Do that.